What if I told you that one of the most criticized blockbuster franchises of the last decade is still printing money?
Even while fans call it ridiculous, critics call it exhausted.
And the internet turns every new trailer into a meme. Because somehow, no matter how many times physics dies on screen,
No matter how many times the story stretches beyond logic, Fast and Furious keeps cashing in. And the real question is not whether the franchise is failing creatively, but why it refuses to fail financially. Why audiences keep showing up. Why studios keep doubling down.
and why what looks like decline on the surface might actually be a calculated strategy underneath.
On paper,
The narrative looks simple. The early films were about street racing, rounded stakes, and a subculture that felt raw and authentic. Then the franchise escalated into international espionage,
global threats, and eventually cars in space.
and somewhere along the way critics started rolling their eyes.
Longtime fans started arguing online, and box office numbers became more complicated.
Domestic drops here, overseas spikes there, headlines screaming franchise fatigue, yet the totals still land in the hundreds of millions.
And studios do not greenlight sequels out of nostalgia. They greenlight them because the math works. And that is where the illusion begins, because failure in Hollywood does not mean what you think it means.
A movie can trend negatively on social media, get lukewarm reviews, and still be wildly profitable, especially when the brand itself has become bigger than individual installments.
Fast and Furious is no longer just a movie series. It is a global product machine.
It is merchandise, streaming deals, international licensing,
Theme park presence, automotive partnerships, and most importantly, a worldwide audience that does not interact with the franchise the same way American film Twitter does. Domestically, numbers may dip.
headlines may focus on decline, but internationally, especially in markets that value spectacle over nuance, the franchise remains accessible.
Simple, loud, emotional, and easy to export.
Because you do not need deep dialogue to understand a car flying between skyscrapers.
You do not need cultural context to understand family,
Revenge, loyalty, and betrayal. These are universal hooks, and universal hooks travel. Then there is brand inertia, something most viewers underestimate. Once a franchise reaches a certain cultural mass,
it stops operating on pure quality and starts operating on recognition. People do not just buy a ticket for plot. They buy it for familiarity, for ritual, for the continuation of something they have followed for years, even if they complain about it. And that paradox is powerful because hate watching, meme culture, ironic enjoyment, all of it still converts into attention.
and attention converts into revenue streams beyond the box office.
Streaming rights alone can offset risk. International PRE sales reduce exposure.
Product placement deals inject millions before a camera even rolls.
And when production budgets are high but globally distributed earnings are higher, the narrative of failure becomes blurry. Another factor is escalation psychology.
Every installment promises something bigger than the last. Even when audiences mock it, they are still curious. How far will they go next?
What line will they cross? What impossible stunt will they attempt? And curiosity is monetizable.
There is also the power of cast continuity. Long-running ensembles create attachment, and attachment drives turnout.
Even if viewers feel the writing has weakened, they still want to see how these characters move forward,
Or at least how the spectacle evolves around them.
but the deeper layer, the one most people miss, is that the franchise shifted genres strategically. It stopped competing with grounded car dramas and started competing with superhero cinema. And in that arena, realism is irrelevant,
Scale is king, emotion is simplified, and logic bends to momentum.
which means criticism based on realism does not necessarily damage the financial model, because the target experience is not plausibility, it is intensity. And here is the twist. Sometimes controversy actually strengthens a franchise's presence. Viral clips, debates, outrage threads, all amplify awareness, and awareness lowers marketing friction.
Because even negative bias keeps the brand circulating in the algorithm. So when people say the franchise is failing,
The real question becomes, failing by what metric?
critical scores, domestic trends, online sentiment, or total global profitability, because those are not the same scoreboard.
And Hollywood only truly cares about one of them.
But this model is not infinite, and that is where things get interesting.
Because brand inertia can slow decline.
It cannot erase it forever. Escalation can attract curiosity, but it can also exhaust it, and international markets can carry weight.
but they are not immune to fatigue either, which means the franchise might not be collapsing, it might be stretching.
And stretching is different from breaking, at least for now. And the most dangerous phase for any blockbuster machine is not when people hate it. It is when they stop talking about it entirely, and Fast and Furious, love it or mock it, still dominates conversation cycles whenever a new installment drops.
So the real tension is not whether it has failed,
but whether it is approaching the edge of diminishing returns,
whether the spectacle can keep scaling without emotional reset, whether the studio will pivot, reboot, or double down, and whether audiences will continue to treat each new release as an event rather than an obligation, because the moment it stops feeling like an event,
the math changes, and when the math changes,
everything changes, and the signs of that shift might already be hiding in plain sight. But here is the layer nobody talks about.
The psychological contract between audience and franchise. Because Fast and Furious stopped selling realism a long time ago,
and started selling escalation as a promise, and once escalation becomes the product,
you are not watching to see if it makes sense.
You are watching to see if they can top themselves again.
And that subtle shift changes the entire business equation, because now each movie functions less like a chapter and more like a live event.
A spectacle benchmark, a challenge thrown at its own legacy.
Studios understand something very simple about modern blockbusters. Repetition kills excitement, but scale delays fatigue. So instead of shrinking after criticism, the franchise expands, bigger locations, bigger stunts, bigger villains, bigger consequences. Because visually bigger equals culturally louder, and louder dominates attention cycles, especially in an era where attention is fragmented across platforms. There is also timing. These films rarely drop quietly. They position themselves as season anchors, as summer detonations, and that scheduling alone reinforces perception of importance, and importance drives turnout even among skeptics. And then there is something more strategic. The franchise does not rely solely on core fans anymore. It relies on casual viewers who dip in and out,
who may skip one installment but return for the next spectacle spike.
Meaning consistency in quality is less important than consistency in visibility. Another reason the money keeps flowing is risk distribution. Blockbuster financing today often spreads exposure across international investors,
CEO production incentives, tax rebates, and brand tie-ins,
which means even a so-called underperformer can recover through laid revenue channels long before streaming and digital windows even activate.
Add to that the global star power factor. Recognizable faces reduce marketing friction overseas because star familiarity travels across language barriers.
And when marketing costs are amortized across a worldwide campaign,
the economics start looking different from the domestic headlines.
But here is the uncomfortable truth. Franchises sometimes survive not because they are thriving, but because they are too big to pivot quickly. Entire pipelines, contracts, spin-off plans,
seam integrations, all of it creates momentum that keeps projects moving forward even if creative signals flash yellow.
And once that machinery is in motion, stopping it is more expensive than finishing it.
The danger though, and this is where the suspense builds, is that brand endurance can create creative complacency.
And creative complacency eventually affects perception. And perception eventually affects turnout. Just not immediately. And that delay is what confuses observers, because financial impact often trails cultural fatigue by several years.
What we may be witnessing is not immunity, but lag.
A slow burn curve where the peak sustains longer than expected before gravity asserts itself.
And studios gamble that by the time gravity hits,
they will have extracted maximum value or executed a strategic reset.
That reset could mean a tonal shift, a generational handoff,
a partial reboot disguised as continuity, or even a calculated finale marketed as the ultimate payoff, because nothing reactivates a wavering audience like the promise of closure.
And that is the next lever, the psychology of endings.
When audiences sense finality, urgency spikes.
Even lapsed viewers return to witness the conclusion of something they once cared about.
Which means even a franchise perceived as declining can experience a financial surge if marketed as the last ride. But if that promise is stretched too thin, if the finale becomes multiple finales, if closure becomes another cliffhanger, the trust erodes, and once trust erodes, brand inertia weakens.
So the real game is balance, stretching without snapping, escalating without parodying itself into irrelevance,
monetizing spectacle without exhausting curiosity.
And the franchise has managed that balancing act longer than most predicted. The question now is not whether it can keep making money next year,
but whether it can reinvent the reason people show up. Because spectacle alone has a ceiling, and when that ceiling is reached,
no amount of horsepower can break through it.
And the early signals of that ceiling are subtle.
Smaller domestic enthusiasm, louder online skepticism,
heavier reliance on overseas lift, none of which equal collapse, but all of which hint at a turning point. And if that turning point arrives,
it will not look like a dramatic crash. It will look like gradual erosion, quieter openings, softer legs, diminished urgency, until one installment finally fails to justify its scale. And that is when the illusion dissolves.
But we are not there yet, not officially, which makes this moment fascinating, because the franchise stands in that rare space between cultural doubt and financial resilience, between mockery and momentum, between decline and dominance. And what happens next will determine whether Fast and Furious becomes a case study in overextension, or one of the most impressive long-term brand survivals in blockbuster history.
And the signs of which path it chooses might already be forming beneath the surface, and this is where everything tightens. Because the franchise is no longer racing against critics, it is racing against time, against audience saturation, against its own myth. And the real tension is not in whether the next movie will open big. It probably will.
The tension is in whether the emotional engine underneath the spectacle is still running hot, or if it is quietly overheating while the fireworks distract us. Every long-running franchise reaches a moment where spectacle alone cannot carry the weight anymore.
Where explosions start to feel routine, where bigger no longer feels surprising. And when that moment hits, it does not announce itself loudly. It creeps in, ticket by ticket, week by week, through softer second weekends and quieter cultural impact. Fast and Furious has survived because it mastered escalation, but escalation is a dangerous drug.
The dosage has to keep increasing to deliver the same effect.
And eventually the body adapts, the shock fades, the audience normalizes the absurd.
And once absurd becomes normal, what is left to shock them with next?
That is the cliff edge the franchise is approaching. Not financial collapse, not sudden disaster, but diminishing awe. And awe is the oxygen of spectacle cinema. The studio can promise the biggest finale ever, the most emotional goodbye, the ultimate sacrifice. But audiences today are trained to doubt finality. They have seen too many last rides turn into extended trilogies,
too many fake endings resurrected by box office opportunity.
And if that skepticism hardens, urgency evaporates. And without urgency, even loyal fans hesitate. They wait for streaming. They skip opening weekend. And that subtle behavioral shift is what transforms resilience into vulnerability.
The franchise is powerful, but it is not invincible. No brand is. Not when attention spans shrink and competition multiplies. Not when blockbuster fatigue becomes a measurable trend rather than a meme. So here we are, watching a machine that still moves at full throttle, but with warning lights flickering beneath the hood. And the question is brutally simple. Can Fast and Furious reinvent its emotional stakes before the spectacle ceiling closes in? Can it make people feel something real again instead of just louder? Can it turn the promise of family back into something more than a slogan?
Because if it can, the franchise resets, it evolves. It becomes a case study in endurance. But if it cannot, if the noise keeps rising while the core keeps thinning,
then the next few installments will not explode.
They will fade, and fading is far more dangerous than failure.
And that is why this moment matters more than any single box office number. Because we are not watching a franchise die. We are watching it balance on a razor.
And the next decision, creative or corporate, could tilt it toward reinvention or toward erosion. And the scariest part is that from the outside,
both paths can look identical at first. Both can open big. Both can trend online.
Both can dominate headlines until suddenly one does not. So the real suspense is not whether Fast and Furious is still making money today.
It is whether it will still command belief tomorrow.
Whether audiences will keep buying escalation,
or whether they are quietly waiting for something new to take its place.
And the signs of that shift, if it is coming, will show up sooner than anyone expects. And when they do, the franchise will have one last choice. Evolve or overextend, reignite or repeat. Because even the fastest machine cannot outrun gravity forever. And the next chapter might reveal which force is stronger.